In 2017, Aimi published a book titled Building Access, Universal Design and the Politics of Disability. They also host the Contra podcast, which is about disability, design justice, and the life world, with recent episodes covering the COVID-19 pandemic, eugenics, and mutual aid. As an educator, Aimi is committed to accessibility, and as a critical maker, their practice spans disability access and disability justice organizing, participatory cartography, fashion, pedagogy, tactical urbanism, and earth repair. Aimi is a certified permaculture designer, co-founder of the Nashville Disability Justice Collective, and an organizer with the Nashville Mutual Aid Collective. Please join me in welcoming Aimi Hamraie.
Hello, thank you so much for the introduction, Laura, and thank you to Shauna Lipton and PNCA for the invitation to speak here today. I'm going to share my screen now. So my name is Aimi Hamraie. I am joining you today from the original homelands of the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Shawnee, and Yuchi peoples who were forcibly removed from these lands through acts of genocide and dispossession. And I just want to say that even though we are in virtual space together, that our subject here today and all of the resources that it takes for us to be here do rely on access to land, resource extraction, displacement, and we continue to be situated within the spaces of racial segregation, surveillance, and policing. So as we work toward more accessible worlds, we also ought to put accessibility into solidarity with anti-colonial and anti-white supremacy work by Indigenous and Black people. So as an access note, today my talk is going to include slides and images, which I will describe. Right now, I appear on your screen as an olive-skinned Iranian person with short, dark, curly hair and round glasses. I am wearing this kind of like mustard-colored shirt with zebras and tigers on it, and I'm in a yellow room. And I present as transmasculine. Here on the slide, my title says Building Access. And that's a reference to the idea that accessibility is not something that is pre-given. It's something that has built up over time, and the ways that we've thought about it have changed and shifted. And that's some of what I'm going to talk about today. And there's also an image on this slide that is a black and white photograph of the elevator lobby of the Taylor Business School. It was taken in the 1970s. There are 3 people in the lobby, 2 standing and 1 person who is seated in a wheelchair. This is the disabled architect, Ronald Mace. He is a white disabled man from North Carolina. And on top of the image are some markings made with like a Sharpie and then some translucent marker, blue marker, that basically draws in what an accessible vestibule would look like. And it makes all these notations of where the elevator buttons need to be wheelchair accessible, how the alarm needs to have both visual and audio components. So for blind and deaf people, how wide the space needs to be for a wheelchair. And I show this image because it's part of the invention of the idea of accessibility. And this idea wasn't just one that came about in the law. This is, at least 20 years before the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's one that came out of the experiences of disabled people. And here, Ronald Mace includes himself in the photograph of the space that could be accessible in order to imagine a future that is more accessible. So some of what I'm going to talk about today is how the idea of accessibility came to be, how it built up over time, especially in the last century, in relationship to ideas about who a disabled person is, what their needs are, what kind of space a disabled person or the collective of disabled people occupy in society. And then also how to build solidarity across different groups of disabled people. And here we have not just kind of physical mobility access, but other kinds of sensory access as well. So today I'm going to talk about three kind of areas of my research. The first is theories of accessibility, and then I'll talk about some of the histories of accessibility. And then I'll focus on practices and controversies surrounding accessibility to give us a sense that accessibility is actually a very politicized concept, and it has shifted over time, and what we mean by it really depends on what politics of disability we practice. Also on this slide is a cover image of my book, Building Access, Universal Design and the Politics of Disability. And the background image on the book shows this sort of technical drawing in black and white of a figure who appears to be masculine, seated in a wheelchair. They extend their arms into space, and they're also seen from overhead. And then all along the sides of the body of the figure are these dimensional notations. This is called an anthropometric drawing, which means it includes measurements of human bodies. And it's a drawing that appears in an architectural handbook called the Graphic Standards. And it basically helps architects understand how to design for wheelchair users. And something I just want to note about this is that this image is abstract and statistical. It's very different than the one I showed on the previous slide. And so what we're getting here already is the sense of the difference between disabled people treated as objects of knowledge that are knowable and stable and somewhat abstract, and disabled people as like living, enfleshed humans who exist in the world. And there's a different politics attached to each of those understandings. So let's begin with theories of accessibility. I'm going to show a series of images of places and scenes that can help us understand what we mean when we talk about access. This is an image of a building called the Blusson Spinal Cord Center in Vancouver, British Columbia. If you're standing outside of the building, you see a glass and steel structure, and it has a very interesting aesthetic element, which is that the atrium is totally transparent from the outside, it's glass, and there's a ramp inside that goes to the first 3 floors of the building. So I'm showing an image of the outside and also the inside. And the inside part of the ramp, basically the railing side of the ramp is covered with kind of like different panels of multicolored plexiglass. And this creates a sort of kaleidoscope effect inside. This is a kind of version of an argument for accessibility that says, rather than put the ramp at the back of the building, we should showcase it and make it the central aesthetic element. And in doing that and announcing that to people who are outside of the building, it's also making a statement that disability access is important, or a certain type of disability access. So this is a spinal cord research and rehabilitation center, and it's a public space at a university. The building that I'm showing on this slide is a very large craftsman style home in suburban Ohio. This is the Universal Design Living Laboratory, which is a private home and kind of a museum slash showroom space, but it is occupied by a disabled woman and her non-disabled husband. And everything in the home is an accessible product that is geared toward disabled consumers. So unfortunately, I don't have images of the inside of the home, but this is from when I visited on a tour. So the outside is this kind of like stone exterior. There's a covered driveway, there's warm lighting, and a really large lawn and driveway. And the inside, this is a very large home. It's over, I think it's over 7,000 square feet. It has all sorts of accessibility features in the kitchen and in the bathrooms, in the hallways. There's an elevator, and things are kind of made for two sizes of people, someone who is seated in a wheelchair and someone who is standing. So this is a different approach to accessibility than the one I showed on the previous slide, because it's really about the idea of disabled people as consumers of sort of luxury goods and selling the idea of accessibility as luxury to people who are aging or who become disabled in their lifetime. It's not exactly about a social justice conception of accessibility. It requires like a great deal of economic and also probably racial privilege to live in a house like this and to be able to access the space and the land that it's on. And so it's not for the majority of disabled people, but this is kind of the public face of a lot of accessibility approaches. In a different vein, here I'm showing a scene from a conference called the Society for Disability Studies. There's an audience in a hotel ballroom. They have their backs to the camera. People are seated in chairs and also power wheelchairs. And then there's a stage where there are 2 standing ASL interpreters and 4 presenters who are seated. And off to the side is a screen with live transcription. And this is a view of access that is very community driven. So this is a disability studies conference. And it's a place where multiple types of access to information are layered on top of each other. And as you can see, as a result, there are also many different kinds of people in the space and people with different access needs because there's a sort of community consensus in this space that what counts as access is not just the wheelchair ramp up to the stage. It's also having ASL interpreters, also having CART, and probably all sorts of other things that are in the space. On this slide, I'm showing a screenshot from a dance party that my lab hosts quarterly. It's called Remote Access. We started hosting it on Zoom when the COVID-19 pandemic started. And basically what is shown on the screen, on the main screen, there's an ASL interpreter. He is a Black man with dreadlocks. He's kind of like making a large like palm motion because there's dancing involved with the interpretation. There's music. And then across the top are people who are participating, some dancing, some sitting in front of their screens. Someone is in a kind of pink room. And this is a disability culture approach to accessibility, where we said, what are the ways that as disabled people, we have historically found uses for technology that help us build community, create spaces of celebration, and be together across long distances in our isolation. And we've been doing this before the pandemic started, but how do we create that and also invite other folks to join us? So, you know, we had a live DJ, we had a line that you would call in to get image description of what was happening on the screen. There were artists who showed their work. There were sound and image descriptions in the chat. So everyone participated in the party by creating access for each other. And this is an approach to access that is more collective, and it's based in the cultures that disabled people create. So one other approach that kind of exists below the surface of some of these ones that I've been showing here is a concept called universal design. This concept basically says that if you design things to be accessible for disabled people, they will also be accessible for some non-disabled people, and we should design the world with disability in mind. So this concept was invented by Ronald Mace, who was on my first slide, in 1985. And then over a decade later, Mace and a bunch of other people at the Center for Universal Design decided to write principles for this concept. And their principles were things that are kind of very technical, and I'll read them in a second. Here I'm showing a poster of the principles that is kind of like hot pink and chartreuse, and then it has all these images on it and the principles written out. They're very technical. They really respond to certain types of design, ergonomics, also user experience, design, perception. But they've been taken up in all of these other spaces that I've shown in really interesting ways. So the principles are equitable use, flexibility in use, simple and intuitive use, perceptible information, tolerance for error, low physical effort, size and space for approach and use. So just from like looking over these, you may kind of be like, oh, what do these mean? Some of them are terms of art. Some of them have clear definitions and some don't. Some are more philosophical, some are more practical. And basically what these principles enabled when they were published in 1997 was the idea of going beyond the bare minimum and going beyond the legal codes to do something that is more kind of creative and open-ended in terms of accessibility. It's a pretty recent concept and approach. Because, and I'm going to give a history of this later, because the primary reasons that we think about accessibility tend to do with disability rights passed by the law. Here on this image, I'm showing an icon of the Americans with Disabilities Act. It looks like 4 blue diamonds like next to each other. One of them has a wheelchair access symbol. One has a blind access symbol, a person using a white cane. One has 3 white hands signing ADA in American Sign Language. And then one has an ear with concentric circles coming out of it to indicate hearing disability. The Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in 1990, and it had a very specific understanding of what disability is and what kinds of rights disabled people ought to have. So some of the discourses that are in the ADA are the idea of independence, that someone should be able to do something on their own without help, economic citizenship, so disabled people should be able to get jobs and also to be consumers, and then also political citizenship as in the form of civil rights. But so the ways that this comes to be materialized, which means like how it shows up in the world, is often through individual forms of access. If you want to claim your rights under the ADA, you do it as an individual. You ask your employer for an accommodation or your school for an accommodation. It's not really like a collective conception of rights, even though it is a civil right. Accessibility is also treated as a legal obligation, so there tends to be a kind of bare minimum approach. There's a lot of emphasis on employment. And then there's this imaginary of disability as legible types. And the image that I'm showing here kind of shows like, what is the definition of disability under the ADA? It tends to be physical disability, blind accessibility, and deaf accessibility. And so there are many types of disabilities that are excluded from it. So there's a new paradigm that I'm going to kind of like trace the evolution of as well in the historical portion of this talk, which is disability justice. And this is a concept that comes out of disability social movements in the last 10 to 15 years. It's led by queer disabled people and disabled people of color. It critiques disability rights because there's so much of an emphasis on capitalism and productivity. And it gives us this idea of collective access and interdependence. And on the slide, I'm showing two images. One is the Principles of Disability Justice, written by Patricia Byrne and Sins Invalid. They are intersectionality, leadership of the most impacted, anti-capitalism, cross-movement organizing, wholeness, sustainability, cross-disability solidarity, interdependence, collective access, and collective liberation. And one project that falls under the auspices of disability justice is Access is Love. This project comes from Alice Wong, Sandy Ho, and Mia Mingus. And there's this image on the slide that says, access is, solidarity is, disability justice is love. And this is an approach to access that, that basically says that we don't create access for each other because the law tells us to or the state tells us to. We do it because we understand it as essential to our relationships and our communities. So both of these are based in a model of transformative justice and kind of creating the worlds that we want to see through mutual aid and solidarity, as opposed to doing these kinds of like checklist style interventions that are often emphasizing the least amount of access possible. Okay, so now I want to shift to talking about histories of accessibility. And what this is going to do is it's going to give us a sense of how the legal approaches to accessibility came to be the way that they are and why the disability justice movement was a necessary response to this. So accessibility responds to an idea that I call in my book the Normate Template, which is designed for the average white, able-bodied male person. And design came to be for this person, this normate, through very specific forms of knowledge. On the left, I'm showing an image by Ernest Irving Fries called Dimensions of the Human Figure from 1934. This was an earlier image available for architects so that they could think about how to design spaces for people. And it shows this kind of black and white image of a body, standing, sitting, climbing, reaching, crawling. And then I'm not sure if you can see my cursor or not, but there's randomly this like high-heeled shoe on the left side of the image because it's a women's shoe. So all these other figures are men. And the thing that it says is different about women and men is their shoe size, which is very interesting. But so you can imagine what kinds of worlds would be built if this is the sort of figure that is kept in mind by architects. And on the right, I'm showing a series of very similar images from a eugenicist, Harry Laughlin, who worked for the military to measure human bodies for the purposes of designing uniforms and cockpits and all sorts of things in the 1920s. And so we see Laughlin measuring the body of a soldier who also stands next to a skeleton. And the human is in all sorts of different positions, standing, crouching, sitting, etc. That data from Harry Laughlin made its way into civilian design in the mid-20th century through the work of a design firm called Henry Dreyfuss Associates, who published these images of people with their statistical data taken from the military and from home economics research for use by product designers. So this is an image of a man named Alvin Tilley, who's a young white man wearing khakis and a button-up shirt. He is responsible for drawing these images, and he's standing next to these two figures that he created called Average Joe and Average Josephine, because they had the average dimensions of Americans according to this data that they had. And what's interesting to me about this image is that Tilley is a real person. Joe and Josephine are statistical fictions. And we really see that just, looking at him next to these figures that he created, he's not really anything like either one of them. Because there's no one who's like either one of them. No one is completely average in all of their measures, and yet that's who the built environment was created for. So things began to change in the mid-20th century when disability researchers in the field of rehabilitation took those same methods that were being used in the military and in product design, and they started to use them to measure wheelchair users for the purposes of creating accessibility standards for the first time. And this is because disabled veterans had been coming back from war. And also there were a lot of people who had survived the polio epidemic who had mobility disabilities and fatigue and things like that. And so at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, there was a rehabilitation program that enlisted a bunch of students who were veterans and also civilians who came to the university and helped do this research, but also the university became accessible for them as a result. And the thing that I want to point out about this is that it wasn't a neutral approach to accessibility. There was a lot of politics behind this because the two types of bodies that were measured in order to create accessibility standards that were then exported all over the world were male disabled veterans who were wheelchair users and who were pretty much all white. And then this figure of like the young disabled woman who's going to become a housewife in this like accessible kitchen that is shown here. So we have the juxtaposition of two images, the disabled housewife in the accessible kitchen and the disabled veteran who's going up this experimental ramp that is outside of a building. And so similar to Joe and Josephine, these two figures were reflecting norms of race, gendered divisions of labor, public and private space, and all of these things in the accessibility standards that were eventually created. And in my book, I have a chapter about how the standards that were created as a result of this, the advocates for them said that they benefited everyone, that it was designed for all. If we design for disability, then everyone benefits. But this research and the benefits of it happened in the Jim Crow era. And the university itself was also racially segregated. And so it completely erased the civil rights era questions and agitation around how to be in public space if you are a Black person, and really just thought of accessibility through the framework of whiteness. And so we can kind of see that a little bit too if we think about the context in which this happened, which is this rehabilitation program that was all about restoring disabled bodies to a supposed standard of normalcy. So I want to read this quote, which is from Leon Chatelain, who was an architect. He was the chair of the American Institute of Architects and the President's Committee on Architectural Barriers for the Handicapped. And he said, "Most important is the day when we can use the tremendous power of the rehabilitated, physically handicapped that is now going to waste. For instead of being dependent on public assistance, they will be gainfully employed in buildings which are freely accessible. The economic potential is enormous, but more important, we will have people who are happy because they're at work in productive, useful occupations. They may truly be a burden, but frequently it is not their fault. It is the lack of awareness of the general public that has created this difficulty." So what I want to point out about this quote is that it's saying that the reason why accessibility is good and important is that it makes disabled people more productive. And that if disabled people are not more productive, then they are burdens to society. And this is something that society should fix. This is a very eugenic logic that was part of the rehabilitation field and continues to be part of the ADA as well. So much of the ADA is about making disabled people productive, but not really questioning why productivity is the gateway to receiving healthcare or rights, or dignified treatment, or life outside of institutions. So it's codified into the history of accessibility to adopt these sorts of logics. In the 60s and 70s, though, there was also a turn away from that kind of thinking through a movement that was called the independent living movement. And it really began at the University of California, Berkeley. This movement took the term independent living from the rehabilitation profession and named itself after it so that they could apply for rehabilitation grants and then redirect them towards radical social protest things and mutual aid projects, and projects of what I've called CRIP technoscience, so disability-led design for political activism. So on this slide, I'm showing the cover of a book by the architects Ray Lifshay and Barbara Winslow. It's called Design for Independent Living. And Lifshay and Winslow worked with the disability activists at Berkeley to document for architects all of the ways that disabled people act as designers in everyday life that are way better than anything an architect who is non-disabled would make. So on the cover, there are images of disabled people like hanging out, being friends, but also using technologies that they created themselves to write, or slings to get out of bed, or like, a string to turn on a light, or some way to like feed an infant, and highlighting these as part of a social movement and as part of an emerging disability culture that was in opposition to the rehabilitation field. And one of the images from that book that I think is really interesting is this one of a bunch of protesters sitting on some stairs, and at least one person who's sitting in a power wheelchair in front of the stairs. Everyone's chanting and someone's holding up a sign that says everybody needs equal access. And this is an idea that's really different than the one I was talking about before, where they were saying like design for all is good because it makes workers more productive. This was explicitly an anti-productivity move that said, like, regardless of your productivity, you should be able to access public space. So this is how Lifshay and Winslow explained this idea and its importance to architects. And you can see how this responds directly to Chatelain. They said, is the objective to assimilate the disabled person into the environment, or is it to accommodate the environment to the person? Currently, the emphasis in barrier-free design is on assimilation. For this seems to assure that the disabled person, once broken in, will be able to operate in a society as a regular person, and that the environment will not undermine his natural agenda to improve himself. This assumption can be counterproductive when designing for accessibility. It may serve only to obscure the fact that the disabled person may have a point of view about the design that challenges what the designers would consider good design. Many designers have, in fact, expressed a certain fear that pressure to accommodate disabled people will jeopardize good design and weaken the design vocabulary. Though certain aspects of the contemporary design vocabulary may have to be reconsidered in making accessible environments, one must also look forward to new items in the design vocabulary that will develop in response to these human needs, ultimately leading toward more humane concepts of what makes for good design. So what they're saying here was that disabled people have a design philosophy that is against assimilation into society. And if architects focus so much on assimilating disabled people into non-disabled norms, then they're going to miss what is valuable about the types of design that disabled people invent and create. So some examples of those ways of invention are here on the left. I'm showing a design for a wheelchair ramp that was made in the late 70s. So they were kind of like inventing the idea of a wheelchair ramp in some ways, experimenting with it. This was done by activists in the movement. It's drawn on lined notebook paper with ballpoint pen, but it looks kind of like an architect's drawing, and it has these notes about using certain kinds of materials, using like deck paint with sand in it to produce friction, to prevent someone from like rolling too fast down the ramp. And then on the right, I'm showing a chunk of concrete that's in the permanent collection at the Smithsonian Institution because it came from a disability activist protest by the group ADAPT, where they actually took a sledgehammer and smashed up a sidewalk and poured a curb ramp with a bag of cement during a protest. So this idea of like designing as a form of direct action is a part of the sort of thing that Lipshay and Winslow were talking about, which is also design against assimilation. So it's focusing on the frictions between disabled people in society. Another concept from the book that is really interesting is non-conforming uses. And they show this image of a person in a power wheelchair wheeling in the street against the flow of traffic precisely because the sidewalk is not accessible because it doesn't have curb cuts, and paying attention to this as a form of being a user that is protesting the built environment. One of the really interesting projects that this movement did was using mapping as a way of making political arguments. So this is a map that the disability historian Bess Williamson found in the archives, and she wrote a great article about it called The People's Sidewalks. And it shows the proposed wheelchair accessibility ramp in Berkeley and where they wanted curb cuts to be added, which was also a way of saying how inaccessible some of those commercial corridors were for disabled students and people in the community. So, so far I've talked about kind of this like 1950s and early 60s era, very normalizing rehabilitation approach to accessibility, which led to the kinds of codes that we have now and also to the Americans with Disabilities Act. And then this movement that was more radical, it was based in social protest and anti-assimilation. A third thing that happened was that people like Ronald Mace started to become architects. So they gained access to architecture school, they gained access to engineering school, and they started to make these really targeted interventions into their profession. So they were activists, but they weren't just like protesting in front of the National Capitol building. They were trying to change how products were designed, how buildings were made, how architects were trained. So a really interesting item from the archive is this advertisement for an architectural drafting table called the Huey Saturn, which is named after the Black Panther Huey Newton. And it basically says, the text basically says that a non-disabled student and a disabled student of architecture can both use the same table. So you don't have to like buy a separate accessible or inaccessible table. And the image shows two people using the same table. One is a young, possibly like white or light-skinned woman wearing bell bottoms and like a turtleneck. There weren't a lot of women in architecture at this time. So this is kind of like also making a feminist statement. And then on the right is a Black man, wheelchair user. The man has an afro and he's using exactly the same table. And they're kind of putting into conversation like Black power, feminist movements, and critiques of architecture. And they're doing it through the design and availability of this product that is essential for architecture students, the drafting table, so that architecture schools could not make the excuse of not enrolling students based on accessibility. There also started to be shifts within the iconography of disability for architects. So these are some of the images that were created by Ronald Mace's firm. The first one is a photograph. It's a bunch of photographs put on top of each other of Mace's wife, whose name is Lachlan, who is also a polio survivor and wheelchair user. And she appears to be in motion going up a brick ramp because of the way that the images are put on each other. So this idea of like dynamism as part of wheelchair use. On the bottom, there's an image from an architectural handbook for accessibility, excuse me. And it shows a Black blind woman using a white cane to walk down the street. And there's a kind of like car parked in the back and a US mailbox. So this is really interesting because, and it's very nondescript, but even the ways that they added people of color and specifically Black people into these images was a very subtle way of critiquing the overwhelming and default whiteness of depictions of disabled people previously. And it's also an expansion of conceptions of disability beyond wheelchair use. And then there's this also one image that says full-length mirrors work well for everyone. And it shows 4 people looking into a mirror. And so there's a Black woman who is standing, looking into the mirror, a Black man who's sitting and shaving, looking into the mirror, a young white girl, and then also a poodle. So there's also this idea of like family and intergenerational access and interspecies access of poodle there. And the poodle is, I think, kind of a joke, but like, it's a way of making a claim of kind of who counts as everyone. And these are images that started to appear in the 70s and 80s. But in contrast to that, when the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in 1990, this kind of weird thing happened where a lot of the discourse around rights, civil rights and access fell away. And there started to be an emphasis on disability and consumer products, often in ways that just like erased disability as a category of oppression. So there's a lighting company called Leviton, which weirdly has the same kind of name as Levittown, which is a very famous racially segregated community in Pennsylvania or in New York. And they created this pamphlet to sell their universal design products along with their security lighting. And so the pamphlet shows these kind of like McMansion style houses that are really well lit outside, and then this multi-generational white family. And it says that, you know, universal design benefits everyone, and we have universal design products. And we also have these security lighting packages that will, I don't know, keep people that you don't want in your neighborhood out of your neighborhood. And that these two things are sold together. And disability is kind of remarkably absent from these depictions, except that there is like a grandparent depicted in one of the images. And so this kind of also tells us a little bit about what I was talking about at the beginning in terms of disability as a consumer category, how it becomes depoliticized. So all that struggle against assimilation that activists were doing in previous generations, that gets erased in favor of kind of like normalizing an idea of accessibility is benefiting everyone. And also, by the way, you should keep your house secure from whoever it is that you're fearing will come into your suburban McMansion. Okay, so that gives us a little bit of a history of how we got to present day. Now I want to just end by talking about a few examples of controversies and practices around access in the present day and how they can push us to think a little bit beyond the disability rights model to more of a disability justice model. So at Vanderbilt, when I arrived there in 2014, there was this narrative that the campus was 100% accessible. And so anytime someone would raise an accessibility question, they would be told the campus is 100% ADA compliant. And so there was this kind of frustration amongst staff and students and faculty about this. And one strategy that my lab came up with to address this was to think about what changes the narrative and what pushes people toward more collective forms of access and away from a view of code and compliance as kind of like the bottom line. And so we started to talk to people on campus about what accessibility meant to them, and basically created what we called a radical standard. And so this was like talking to disability organizations and disabled people, but also like the LGBTQI Center, the Women's Center, the Black Students Center, and kind of raising these questions of who gets to access space and how can we think about that intersectionally. And then from that, we created a survey that didn't have the elements of a code in the sense of specific measurements. It was more like questions that got people to think critically about this very familiar to them campus environment. And we hosted a series of events called Mapathons, where hundreds of students and staff and faculty showed up and went out to buildings on campus and surveyed them using this radical standard. So on this slide, I'm showing a group of 3 people kind of measure, like holding a tape measure, looking at a survey in a room, a checklist survey from the Mapathons, and the poster of the Mapathon itself, which has this kind of stylized like map dot with a Vanderbilt star that is gold in the middle of it. And so what we wanted to do was kind of disrupt the narrative about compliance. And that did basically happen, because as soon as we started to collect this data, the institution wanted to also collect its own data. And it started an accessibility data collection project in which they hired a whole team of disabled students who stayed for a summer and did an ADA audit of the campus. So it wasn't the radical standard audit, but it was an audit that made the institution itself have to acknowledge how inaccessible it was. And from there, we engaged in a master planning process, the first ever disability access master plan for the campus, which is a 40-year plan, so that the codes got rewritten for the campus, the ways that architecture is built on campus got changed, the way that landscaping happens. And they did some really cool stuff as a result of that. So for example, one of the solutions that they came up with that really went beyond the ADA code, which I'm showing here on the slide, is that there are 2 historic buildings that were brick and had these like columns. Neither one of them had any place to put in an elevator shaft. And so what they did was they built a building in between them that joined them together. It's kind of more of a modern like glass building. And that became the place where the elevator went. And it facilitated new forms of like being in space together. So on paper, this looked really good. When we were imagining it, it looked really good. And it is good. However, there's some weird stuff that happened with this as well, because this is the interior of that building. This was supposed to be a building enabling access and celebrating access. And the central design feature is actually this kind of monumental staircase. There's a lot of beautiful natural light, there's beautiful wood, but there's a staircase at the center instead of putting the stair in the back. This is different than the building that had like the ramp that went to every floor, right? And there is an elevator, but it's not central. And the staircase itself has seating on it that is not wheelchair accessible. So it's kind of a disappointing outcome for something that was supposed to be about accessibility and going beyond the code. And the reason why this happened was that the campus was also trying to meet a sustainability standard from the Living Building Challenge that emphasized health and wellness. And the kind of emblem of health, for some reason, has become taking the stairs to like burn calories, which is also an ableist aesthetic and functional feature. And so that was what got foregrounded in the space, even though this was the result of an accessibility master plan. And it just highlighted for me the tensions between creating codes and relying on them, and creating the kinds of standards that ask really critical questions that our project was asking, that were things like, how can a building be accessible if it's named after the Confederacy? We literally had a building called Confederate Hall. What are the intersections of bathroom access for disabled people and trans people, et cetera? So this kind of code asks different questions than that. They're kind of more like assimilation focused questions. In the research that I'm doing now on public space and public life, there are these big debates about things like bicycle lanes and active transportation. Is it ableist to build a city that is primarily for bicycles? So here I'm showing an image from an open streets event where the streets were closed off so people could cycle and walk. And then a type of structure, infrastructure, that's called a complete street, where you have a bike lane, a sidewalk, and a street, and the bike lane is protected. And those of you who are in Portland, like, you have tons of great infrastructure that's like this, and this is probably very typical for you, but in places like Nashville, where I live, this is less typical. And so as these sorts of things are being built, there are more questions that are raised about accessibility. And so there are intersections here between how we talk about access in terms of like disability justice or in terms of disability rights, and some of the other struggles that are happening around space right now. This is a quote I'm showing from the Untokening Collective and their principles of mobility justice. And they're talking back to people who say that we need more bike lanes and sidewalks because cars are dangerous and they're killing pedestrians. So they say, safety is more than protection from cars. When people live at the intersection of multiple vectors of oppression, unfettered access to mobility and public space are not guaranteed. Racism, sexism, classism, ableism, xenophobia, homophobia, and constraints imposed upon gender nonconforming folks can make the public space hostile to many. Bodies encounter different risks and have different needs. So this is highlighting some of the similar kinds of critiques I was bringing up with how disability access was created under regimes of whiteness. And in a similar way, some of these questions about like, how do we build bike lanes that are promoting safety for pedestrians also ask us to think of intersectionally and to ask questions like, will having a bike lane prevent the police from attacking or possibly killing a Black person? And will having a bike lane prevent the police from arresting a person who appears to have a mental disability, who seems to be out of place or behaving a certain way in public space? And so those forms of safety and access to a full life are not typically part of the discourse on pedestrian safety. And disability justice would kind of align more with mobility justice in this case, to ask these questions and also to think about who gets to claim easy access to public space, that this question is racialized, gendered, it's shaped by ableism, and all of these things. Okay. Another intersection that is really important to think about is housing justice. And here I'm thinking with the late disability justice organizer, Stacy Milburn, who wrote about a concept that she called access washing. And so on this slide, I'm showing an image of a bunch of cars going in traffic up to an intersection, and then on the sidewalk, there are a lot of tents that people are living in. And this is because there's a housing crisis in the Bay Area. And Stacy, who lived in the Bay Area and who did a lot of activism and mutual aid, offered the concept of access washing to call out the ways that the policing of unhoused people was being done in the name of the Americans with Disabilities Act, so that people were getting citations for having a tent city or having tents on the sidewalk without consideration that many of the people who were unhoused also may have been disabled. And they may or may not have been disabled in ways that are legible under the ADA or are given as much protection. But all of these questions of like safety, who gets to be in public space, et cetera, are activated by this. And Stacey also tied this then to gentrification and asking questions like, why do we associate gentrification with better health outcomes when what we're doing is driving out the most marginalized disabled people? And then the final point that I'll just touch on that brings us back to these intersections between disability justice and transformative justice and abolition is carceral politics. And if you want to read about this more, there's a great book by Liat Ben Moshe called Decarcerating Disability. And I've learned a lot from that book. So on this slide, there are two images. One is of a prisoner who's a wheelchair user being kind of ushered through a gate by a corrections officer. And for me, this kind of signifies some of the ways that there's an emerging discourse of thinking about accessibility in prisons and saying like, there are disabled people going to prison, so we need to make the prisons more accessible, which is very different than an abolitionist response that would say, why do we incarcerate anyone? And why is there such an over-incarceration and over-policing of disabled people? And so to kind of get at some of that, Sins Invalid, the Disability Justice Collective, and the artist Micah Bazant, one of the images that they've created is this one that's on the right that shows a Black woman in an orange jumpsuit who's a wheelchair user linking arms with a Palestinian woman wearing white and hijab and who's a double amputee. And the text says, disability justice means resisting together from solitary cells to open air prisons. And so what this is doing is kind of highlighting the politics of disability justice and thinking about access and confinement and how there are these transnational struggles that can be highlighted and solidarities that can be forged, but that these are issues of accessibility that are not considered by the ADA. And so they're not part of the kind of mainstream of disability rights that asks us to think about who is a disabled person in the societal perception, and then what are the best ways of facilitating access for, by, and with disabled people. So I'm going to stop there now, and I would welcome any questions or comments from the audience.
Feel free to write your questions in the Q&A, or you can raise your hand if you would prefer to speak. Everyone is saying thank you for such a comprehensive presentation, so informative and historically informed, yet so future looking as well at the same time. We really appreciate the talk. And I know that there were a lot of snaps and excitement happening in the chat while you were talking as well.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Okay, I see Laura is asking a question about how disability justice figures into mutual aid work. Thank you, Laura. That's a great question. So when the pandemic started here in Nashville, we had just had a tornado that the week before lockdown had just destroyed a lot of homes and public buildings. And so at that point, a bunch of mutual aid work had started to come together. And the people who are leading the mutual aid work, many of them were disabled people who were already part of our disability justice collective. I think it was just kind of like what we do. Like we already do mutual aid in the collective, and we kind of saw an opportunity to help extend some of the infrastructure of that out and to help folks figure out how to facilitate mutual aid and to work in solidarity with other folks who are doing mutual aid kind of like in their own communities. And so the leadership of the mutual aid collective, if there is such a thing, or like the facilitation of it, ended up being like a lot of disabled people. And it has continued to be that way as well. And so some of the interesting things that have come about as a result of that is that we bring a lot of disability justice concepts and values into our organizing. Like we do collective care at least once a month for the whole collective. So people will come and like make offerings, they'll lead us through different care activities. And we do that just as much as we do political education and facilitating the exchange of resources and things like that. Okay, there's a question that says, can you give us your thoughts on designers without disabilities designing for those with disabilities? This is a great question. It gets debated a lot. Obviously, not everybody who works in the realm of disability design will identify as disabled, but there are mixed results with designing for disabled people, and it depends on whether those designers have a relationship to disability culture and community and what their analysis is. So a good person to follow on this is Liz Jackson, who has this brilliant concept of the disability dongle, D-O-N-G-L-E. And she says that a disability dongle is this sort of well-intentioned technology that is not actually useful for disabled people. For example, like wheelchairs that climb stairs or gloves that translate ASL into spoken language. There are so many designers who have designed those things over and over and over again, and so much effort and money that has gone into them. And they're basically like not usable or accessible financially, whereas there's less emphasis put on things that disabled people actually need, like better wheelchair batteries or more accessible infrastructures. So if you are a non-disabled person designing disability things, you know, it's good to be part of disability culture and figure out how to be in solidarity and not assume that you know what the needs are. Let's see. How do you handle designing accessibility when different accessibility needs contradict each other? This is a really good question, and it's actually one that Stacy Milburn addresses in her work on access washing. She points out that in disability community, we're very accustomed to having different access needs and that not being the end of the conversation. So if you're like, I need this, and someone else is like, I can't have that, I need this other thing. In non-disabled spaces, that may just mean you are like incompatible, you can't be in the same space. But in disability spaces, we use that as an opportunity to design a different kind of solution. So I can give an example. of in the 70s in Berkeley, when activists were trying to design curb cuts and they were proposing a standard for curb cuts. The first ones it was like the street would just go down, the sidewalk would just like go down into the street, and it was great for wheelchair users, but it was not good for blind people because blind people learn to navigate the street using like texture and different kinds of markers that come up for their white canes. So blind people were harmed by this curb cut design. And they could have just like called off the curb cuts. But instead what they did was they worked together, the wheelchair users and the blind people in this movement. And they invented what is now called tactile paving, which is those raised dots, yellow, often dots like on the edge of a curb cut, that the texture indicates that the street is coming. It also like slows down a wheelchair or helps a wheelchair climb up the curb cut. And they were doing it with like cat litter or glitter mixed into paint and stuff like that to create friction. And so that was a design solution that ended up resolving what seemed like an incompatibility between two groups of disabled people. Okay, let's see. The next question says, the interplay of carceral politics and disability justice makes me wonder, with regard toward the state, are there similar discussions you've seen underway around displaced communities, this shallow framing of access, and militarized borders? That's such a good question. I wish that there was more discussion about this. For example, like in the context of ICE detention facilities and family separations and stuff. We know also, because of everything that's happening during the pandemic, that people are becoming disabled in those spaces. And there's so many stories from like both in the Obama era and in the Trump era about like how disabled people were seeking asylum in the US, or people were becoming disabled on the way to seek asylum, and then were incarcerated and were like denied insulin or denied like healthcare or accessible beds and whatever. And, you know, like any kind of incarceration is like a terrible thing for anyone. And for disabled people, it represents this way that state violence often like creates more disability. And I think that there's a lot more room here for forging solidarities around that specific issue and for framing the issue in that way. Very often when we talk about ICE detention facilities, we're really focused on like the construct of the family that is being separated. We may think about health and people's like lifespans and things like that. But I haven't really seen an articulation of this as a disability issue. And again, that may be because the ADA is not seen as applying to people whose citizenship status is contested. Okay, any other questions?
Thank you again so much.
Yeah, thank you.
And our last event of the symposium will take place at 5 p.m. and it is a reading by Cedar Saigo and Jay Dodd. So please join us again. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.